And we'll see if that comes into play for Lest, and they're getting their match kickstarted there. So there it is, Mana Surge Red versus Lest here, and it looks like the starting match is going to be Dragon versus Rune, which is always very interesting. That ramp versus the possible, and I'm going to assume that he's playing D-Shift because a lot of people are these days. Is it all about kind of the aggressive ramping for Dragoncraft? What is Red looking to do here?
Well, Mofu, actually, I wanted to ask you a question about this matchup. So I know that in the past, D-Shift has always had the edge over Ramp Dragoncraft. Do you think that, after looking at Red's list, that he has anything that can push him over the top to beat D-Shift?
I actually have always found this matchup to kind of be able to go either way, because while Dragoncraft as a class doesn't have very much pressure it can put on early, there is one significant weakness in D-Shift, which is it isn't very efficient with putting up wards. Now it does run Golem Assault, which is like, the bodies from Golem Assault are large enough to dissuade things like Forte from hitting face, but that comes pretty late in the game where Dragoncraft has already had a lot of time to ramp. So I think this largely comes down to whether or not the Dragon side of things can put on enough damage with Ayala and then manage to smash face with Forte and things like Genesis Dragon at an early enough time that D-Shift hasn't gotten to its combo yet.
Perfectly said. And I would like to point out that Red is actually playing 3 Fortes and 3 Urds. So he is ready to at least combo, if not just keep going in with Fortes if he can draw enough of them.
Mm-hmm. This is a position I see a lot, or probably every single time I see this matchup. The Ayalas seem to be one of the biggest questions for the side of D-Shift. Just because it's not a Kaleidoscope target. There's nothing in the deck like Petrify that can deal with it without giving the opponent ramp, but it itself can stay on board, especially if evolved or if it makes it that far, as a threat.
Yep, and it's super scary, right? I think a lot of D-Shift players tend to leave it in play until it is evolved, and then they take it out just because they can't afford to keep taking that amount of damage, which I find very interesting. It does slow them down in the early game, but it does get all that free damage off, and we're going to see even more damage this turn. Maybe even play the Forte, but yeah, I would save it for the Evolve on the Ayala this turn. But yeah, it's always tricky to play against. You never really know what to do. Because if you ramp them early and they don't have anything, you could just stave off a ton of damage that you would normally take in that spot.
Yeah, that's already 6 damage dealt from this Ayala, which in turn means a single evolved Forte into a Genesis Dragon, if we see that come out later, is already enough. I think the reach offered by this one card can sometimes just define this entire matchup by itself.
Right, which I think is crazy. It's a very unassuming card, and I think we all know the problems with dealing with opposing Ayalas, especially in the mirror. The mirror matchups get really crazy when you're deciding when you want to pop each other's Ayalas.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like from left side of the things, he has a slower hand, but he does have the owl to push him back forward. It's realistically, like you said, can he survive through the course of the next few turns? And I think he has to start wiping the board. I don't think he can wait any longer.
I agree with that. There's a certain point at which the magic owls just have to be thrown out, and I empathize with being 13 cards into the deck and not having a D-Shift to be ticking down yet with a lot of spells that he probably wants to go onto it otherwise. Do you think that throwing things out, such as Chimera or otherwise, to try to get tempo against a Storm Ramp Dragon list like this is going to get him very far?
I like it, and there's only one reason behind it. One, you don't have D-Shift, okay? That's the big reason. The other smaller reasons are, if you start producing threats that Dragon has to deal with, you might be able to dissuade them from just being able to jam Forte and going face every single turn, right? So if you can make them play defensive even for a turn, you can eke out that extra turn, and realistically, because he has no D-Shift, he's got to rely on the giant Chimera that he's got in his hand.
My spear will stop you.
It seems that he decided to hold the Chimeras last turn instead, though, and in turn, he's opened himself up to that last 7 points of damage from the Queen of the Dreadsea with the other Forte and the Dragoon Scyther.
Yep. He doesn't even need to play the Queen of the Dreadsea. That would be overly flashy, and I think you can't actually play both of those after the Queen of the Dreadsea because they're both dragon cards. But Those
Oh,
two
right.
cards can come down next turn and win the game without an opposing ward, as you said. And yeah, I think Les just waited a little too long. It's always tricky in a matchup like this, but if you can't force your dragon opponent to be defensive, then they can literally do what you see Red doing. Just attack every single turn, throw caution to the wind, like whatever I have to deal damage, I'm just throwing it into play. Plus, he did draw a few of his fortes and a Scyther, so he did get a pretty good draw in this matchup.
I'm also noticing that there's only one Golem Assault and one copy of Summon Ice Storm in Lest's list, meaning even 18 cards into his deck, it's very difficult to make sure he can find options for ward. So all of the storm damage from red side is just going face as soon as he gets access to it.
Yep. And we saw it every single turn. After the Ayala turns, it was Forte, and Scyther, and that's just exact lethal. Red going up one game.
It's a quick matchup for two decks that tend to take their time with their plays.
Right. I think Red got one of those fortunate draws. Whenever you're playing Ramp Dragon against D-Shift, you're just like, please draw my Fortes if you're playing them. And Red had no problem with that this game. So now we get to slip into a matchup of Neutral Forest is what Red has left into less D-Shift and Tempo Haven. So if Lest can manage, which I believe he'll probably switch to his Tempo Haven list here. If he can manage to win this, he's got to beat Beauty and the Beast with his D-Shift deck.
I haven't really seen Neutral Forest and D-Shift face off that often. It seems to be another one of those strange matchups to me, where in theory, a card like Beauty and the Beast just crushes a list like D-Shift that is so heavily reliant on spells to remove things from board. But at the same time, turn 6 is now considered the late game in D-Shift's game plan.
That's true. That's true. If you get perfect D-Shift, as Envy actually spoke about, it can go off as early as turn 7, especially with Magic Owls or multiple Magic Owls and things like that. So I definitely agree with you. In practice, though, we have seen Beauty and the Beast pretty consistently take out D-Shift, if they get it.
Now, this is actually a matchup, before we get to see that one, that I'm not really particularly familiar with. You said you like seeing things like this sort of Haven list, the kind that runs a lot of Storm, that runs
This is
Taurus
my
as well.
favorite Haven list at the moment. This is literally my favorite Haven list. Aether of the White Wing with Taurus top end. You've got Moon Owl Mirage in the 6-drop slot to get more aggressive with the list. This is a matchup that's really heavily going to rely on the tempo that Les can push. Fortunately, he's against a neutral Haven deck that sometimes can't put up a lot of defenses, Hector being the big thing that they can do, which Red does have access to. But if Les can push enough early damage in, then the Tauruses, the consistent Tauruses in the late game, can just push this matchup over the rails.
What do you think about the general decision-making process behind the turn 2 on when playing a Tempo Haven list like this? I know that this sort of deck always runs a lot of 2-drops. It has, as you can see, Lyrial. It runs like techs like Frog Cleric, Heavenly Hound, Princess Snow White, and Area. But when we see a lot of these in his hand like this, what inspires him to go for the Area first into the Snow White later?
Realistically, I think he doesn't need to trade right now. And he wants to save cards like Lyrial for the Evo turns. Snow White isn't really going to get a lot of value off of the board at the moment, especially on the draw. It's kind of slow, and you can get a lot more tempo popping the Aria faster. I actually would have liked to see him play the second Aria here as well, because you're not really worried about the aggressive side from Red, and he has Lyrial coming up next turn that he could play alongside of the Snow White and kind of take over the board from that point, with the Arias already ticking down. So I think he kind of went half and half here. And I would have liked to see both amulets instead.
Something I just noticed about how Princess Snow White can affect the early game, although it caused Red to have to react to it pretty significantly, I think another part of playing it early is getting that 1 tick of damage that Lyrial can then combine with her Evolve effect to finish off. But Red played pretty specifically around that, perhaps not even seeing the Lyrial, but just wanting to get rid of the Snow White.
Right, and honestly, with open deck lists, you can do things like that. I mean, if your opponent makes a bold move, like just playing a Snow White into your board, you know, you got to be thinking, what can they do with that? If Lyrial's the best possible option, let's just make it not an option. And I think Red made the correct read there and positioned himself to not have to deal with Lyrial.
With that said, that still opens up 2 lines of play to Lest here. He could still go for the Lyrial and use that to bounce onto activating the Heavenly Hounds effect. Or here's a card that I actually heard you say you liked a lot previously. I can't remember when, But Birdkeeping Disciple, I remember that earlier in Tempo Haven there were decks that would completely drop Priest of the Cudgel for this, and I think that Lest is actually running both as full playsets of 3. Now,
He is.
how do you think Birdkeeping Disciple changes up this deck list from before?
So Birdkeeping Disciple realistically just it's a power play, right? Like on turn 4, whenever you're playing a tempo deck, if you're playing Priest of the Cudgel, it never feels good to be on the play with that card. It just never feels good at all. Birdkeeping Disciple is good on both the play and the draw, and it preserves what you're trying to do, which is keep tempo on board, keep more things in play than your opponent. He decided to run the full suite of both. I think that's fine. It's kind of like tuning your sword deck to be running Genos and Floral Fencers. I've never really been a big fan of that, but that's a consistency on turn 4 thing that some players really like on their Evo turns. For me, if you're playing cards especially like Lyrial and Hound, I don't think you need that many 4-drops. But it's all preference, right? It's just what you like to see in your opening hand and in the mid game. So.
Right. Pretty fortunate, I think, to then also, alongside the consistency of having a lot of 4-drops, I'm noticing, at least in the past, I remember Haven usually had a bit of a hard time finding something to do on turn 5 right afterwards. Birdkeeping Disciple giving you a later play with Opinion Prayer ticking down was pretty nice. But here, I think, we see Globe of the Starways as a 1-drop that can follow alongside any of the 4-drops, which develops something on the turn you play it is also a really interesting thing about this deck.
Lest actually has a different read on the metagame. So we saw Odile in his Shadow list that got banned. We also see 2 copies of Ancient Lion Spirit in his Haven deck. So he's really aware of like this mid-range thing that's going on. And just, he wants a lot of board clear. I think it's kind of an interesting choice with Aether of the White Wing. It just gives you a nice little toolbox kit in your deck to be a little bit more defensive on turn 6 with Aether and a little bit more aggressive on turn 7 with Aether to pull the Moonal Mirage. So I think he's kind of tempered in every single slot in his deck. You know, he's got the Priests, he's got the Birdkeeping Disciples, and then he's got the Ancient Lion Spirits into the Moonals, into the Taurus. So he knows how to play his deck, and that's why it's built this way.
Now that you actually mention it like that, this is a really interesting type of list. Usually in the old days of Tempo Haven that I think most people are familiar with, the slot of either of the White Wing and the entire deck building dynamic was just around figuring out how much damage you could get in with Garuda. But the entire follower lineup has just completely transformed around Aether of the White Wing.
I just like it. Like, Haven feels so flexible now. You can do pretty much anything you want with it. You can be completely defensive with Aether. You can be completely offensive. You can take a Lest approach and kind of go half and half, depending on how you want to play the deck. It just opens up everything for Haven. It's literally my favorite card that came out for Haven in the new set, and maybe for Haven in the entire game so far, just because of what it opens up for Haven.
I actually agree with, like, I haven't really put a lot of thought into this before, but I remember there's a history of Haven legendaries where all of them tend to be some sort of a variation on an attempt to make Skullfane into something else. That being like Eidolon or Heresy's Avatar or something like that. But Aether really just drops down this very, very simple effect, really. Not hard to understand at all, yet it just creates its own entirely new archetype.
And that archetype can be whatever you want it to be, kids. So get out your Aether of the White Wings and start building your toolboxes. Alright, so here Les is actually kind of on the back foot. However, if he can manage to push past this, Red doesn't really have a lot of gas to back up anything. He's just got a bunch of 2/2s left over.
I think the value of those 2/2s is pretty high at this in this kind of position, though, where they're both clean of evolution points. I think this Moonal Mirage is the last immediate threat that Lest has, unless he draws something else. And Red has still a pretty enormous life advantage on him.
That is true. And these Beast Call Arias, like I said, not playing them early, this is kind of the situation I never like to be in. Especially against a slower deck like Neutral Forest. I don't want these to be stuck in my hand, because now they're just going to sit here. They eventually might see play, but they're not going to affect the game in any relevant time frame, unless Les can find other cards to kind of push the board control in his favor. Which he just did draw some pretty nice cards.
That he did. Black and Scripture able to fight against the onslaught of 2-drops on Red side, but so if you're Lest here, because I'm not really a professional Haven player much, I've only really picked up the class recently because of Take-Two. Something that I think a lot of people approach this class and are not sure of is if these Beast Call areas haven't been dropped in the early game, you're in a position like this where you're ahead on board, but you need to be reactive. In what kind of circumstance are you actually able to get any value out of them? Do you expect him to be able to play them this game? Looks like he goes for one of them.
Realistically, the only way you can play them is how you see Les play them at this point. I can deal with as much of the board as I possibly can, but I need to get these Beast Call areas out so that they can have value at some point. It's just tough. It puts you in the spot you don't want to be in the first place, but you have to get them out.
Mm-hmm. He will get a pretty fair amount of, or at least I'm noticing at least the amount of impact that a person can get off of the average follower or spawn of followers, even amulet ones, decreases a lot when you're in a late game position like this, where there's no evolutions left and everything is being played for its stat line if it has an evolve effect like Priest of the Cudgel, which is just no longer relevant. So even just the 2 damage that comes out of Beast Call area is going to be very important. But I think he's in a position where he really needs that kind of immediate impact soon, as the Moon Almirage and Taurus, I'm like wincing in pain watching those trades. Having to trade like all of his reach into just a single Beauty and the Beast.
Wait a minute,
So it's
Taurus
like
dies there?
position.
Hold on. I've got a question
Yeah.
about this. I thought Taurus didn't take damage on the crackback.
It's that Taurus will deal damage equal to its attack when it attacks, but because Beauty and the Beast doesn't take damage from effects, and
Right.
that's still considered an effect damage, he actually just ate that full hit from
That's
Beauty
right.
and the Beast.
That's right. Interesting interactions. I don't think Les knew it either. I think Les was like, he probably did know it, and then he just saw the flood of, 2/2s. This is another situation where, again, Priest of the Cudgel's a little off for me, because when the Evo points are gone, it, again, doesn't do anything, whereas Birdkeeping Disciple still has value. But, as we see, Red is going to take this game, and he gets a point added to his score, doing everything he possibly can to BM Lest here.
Everything he possibly can. And Lest given the dying taunt as he drops that game. So Mana Surge Red going up 1-0 against Lest here. Let's going down 0-1. Something I want to mention, Red always has a very good read on the meta. It seems to be the thing that he keeps up with the most. And I feel like his decks were very well tuned for that, right?